So we know quite a bit about what children with Down syndrome display as they begin to develop. There's a lot of descriptive literature that talks about their strengths and weaknesses in cognitive functioning, in communication skills, in motor skills, and these patterns that are described lead to researchers who talk about what's called a Down syndrome behavioral phenotype. So a behavioral phenotype would be a heightened probability or a heightened likelihood of displaying certain behavioral characteristics, and they would be associated with that particular genotype. It doesn't mean that all children with Down syndrome will display weaknesses in motor development or weaknesses in communication skills, just that they'll be more likely to have those particular behavioral characteristics. So some of the things we see in Down syndrome, we see some strengths in social behavior, visual and imitative skills, receptive language as compared to their expressive or vocal language, and we see weaknesses in motor development, early communication skills like requesting, and some areas of cognitive development, in particular short-term memory. I have a background in behavior analysis. And one of the things that we've tried to do is make this idea of a Down syndrome behavioral phenotype fit into how we approach intervention within behavior analysis. So I'm sure you may have some familiarity with the general approach of behavior analysis, thinking about a 3 or a 4-term contingency, where we have antecedents which precede a behavior. They set the occasion for that behavior. They indicate what consequences will and will not be available for particular responses. And then we have behaviors that an organism emits, and those are followed by consequences which serve to either increase or decrease the likelihood of that behavior. One of the other terms, the 4th term, is referred to as a motivating operation. And this is really the context for certain behaviors to occur. So a motivating operation refers to an environmental event that alters the value of certain consequences and the frequency of behavior associated with those consequences. So if you think about something like food deprivation, this would alter the value of food as a reinforcer. It would make it more valuable, and the behaviors which are associated with getting food would increase. So asking for food, going to the fridge, opening your cupboards, all of those behaviors would increase when there's food deprivation. The same would be true for something like attention. When you receive a lot of attention, the value of attention as a reinforcer would decrease, and you would perform fewer behaviors that have led to attention in the past. So we can start to think about a behavioral phenotype as potentially functioning as a motivating operation. If we think about an individual's genetics, they may influence their sensitivity to certain environmental stimuli. They may alter the value of certain consequences and act as a motivating operation. So if pain or sleep deprivation or illness could all function, all these biological things could function as motivating operations, perhaps some of the characteristics of someone's genotype could also function as a motivating operation. And so if we think about particular syndromes that are associated with a genetic etiology, we can see that something like autism can change the value of social consequences, making them less effective as a reinforcer. For someone with Prader-Willi syndrome, the value of food may increase as a reinforcer as well, and we see things like food hoarding and food stealing responses. And for Down syndrome, there may be an increased value of something like social consequences because of those increased skills in social relatability. And so then their genotype would affect what reinforcers we might choose to use with those particular individuals. It might dictate what types of prompts we use for that individual. And so we can use this behavioral phenotype in conjunction with a behavior analytic perspective to tailor intervention to meet those needs. And the lab that I used to work in has done a lot of work, and I've done some work in using the behavioral phenotype to help inform intervention. So they've done some work on requesting and imitation. So using social consequences as a reinforcer, prompting, using the visual cues in studies of short-term memory, all trying to build on those strengths for individuals with Down syndrome and specifically tailor intervention to the weaknesses. And this approach may be more effective than some kind of standard approach that isn't tailored to those specific needs of individuals with Down syndrome. So across all these interventions, there are some common characteristics. We have been using behavior analytic interventions. They are done at a relatively high intensity. They involve structured, teacher-directed learning opportunities, which have high rates of prompting and reinforcement, and they also involve error correction procedures. So across all of these studies, we've really identified some key components which are effective for increasing these different skills in individuals with Down syndrome. And although we've begun to advance and identify the particular types of interventions which are effective for individuals with Down syndrome, we haven't yet spent the time to identify how to optimize or make those interventions better than what they already are. So we've really looked at the effectiveness rather than how to make them more efficient. So one thing that we might want to do is think about how can we take components and make them more efficient. And one approach to this may be to modify the intensity at which these components are delivered. And so this is my area of interest, is how does modifying the intensity of intervention affect outcomes for these learners? In looking at intervention intensity, we use a model which was adopted from a medical model. So Warren, Fay, and Yoder presented a way to think about a psychosocial intervention in the same way that you might think about the intensity of a medical intervention. And so they describe the dose. So in these behavior analytic interventions, we might think of things like what happens within a session. That would be a dose of intervention. How many teaching opportunities are there? How long is that session? How do we distribute those opportunities over the course of a single session? And then we have the dose frequency. So how often do they receive that intervention? Do they get it 1 time a week? Do they get it 4 times a week? Are they getting it every day? And we have the total intervention duration. So over what period of time do we continue to deliver these intervention sessions? Do we go on for 6 weeks? Do we do it for many years? Thinking about how long that intervention is. And they describe some way to come up with a numerical metric of the intensity of intervention. So if you take the product of all of these, you get some kind of cumulative intervention intensity. I'm not sure how useful this final metric is because you lose so much of the information from each of those pieces, but it is one potential way to say that this intervention is more intense than another intervention, some way to factor in all of these pieces. They also talk about one additional measure of intensity, and they call this the dose form. So just like you could have an injection or a pill or a tablet, you may also have different forms of psychosocial interventions. And we can think about these as some continuum of intensity. So in a psychosocial intervention, we might think of it occurring in a clinic as more intense than occurring in the home. Or a teacher delivering the intervention versus a parent, a teacher would be considered more intense than a parent. And some of this may be related to just the intervention type or the philosophy, but there is also some value in thinking about it in terms of intensity as well. So taking this model of intervention intensity, we went and looked at what children with Down syndrome typically receive in terms of intensity. So can we find out, just looking at the literature, what intensity we should deliver intervention to these individuals? And we did a review of the literature Interestingly, we only found about 37 studies which actually taught communication to individuals with Down syndrome using an experimental design, which is a little kind of scary considering we've known about Down syndrome for so long, and yet there's so little in terms of intervention studies. And we pulled out of studies the duration, the opportunities per session, which would both be characteristics of dose, the sessions per week, and the total intervention duration. And what we found was that there was a huge variability in the type of intensities that were being delivered to these individuals. So you can see here those 4 characteristics, the number of studies that reported it, and then that converted to a percentage, and then the ranges. So the ranges here, we're seeing sessions that are 5 minutes to 60 minutes. We're getting 1 opportunity to 50 opportunities. Sessions can occur for 3 sessions total to 108 sessions total. So it's just really, it's unclear what the best amount of intervention is for these individuals. And then we also see that not everyone tells us. So that's a real limitation in the literature as well, is that people don't always say how many opportunities they're providing in their intervention sessions, or they're not telling us how many sessions per week. And again, this may also be related to philosophy. If I'm doing discrete trial teaching, I know how many opportunities I'm going to give in a session. But if I'm doing perhaps a learner-directed naturalistic style teaching, I don't necessarily know how many opportunities occurred. And it may be beneficial to start to think about measuring those things. So knowing that they're not reporting it, perhaps they should try and calculate that in some way, even if it is a learner-directed intervention. The other thing that's interesting about intensity is there appears to be some interaction between particular etiologies and intensity. And of course, lots of people have been talking about autism over the course of these RAIN brown bags, and we know that for learners with autism, a really high intensity is beneficial in terms of a behavior analytic intervention. It's recommended that they get about 40 hours a week of a lot of structured teaching opportunities. So intensity appears to be helpful for that particular etiology of disability. And there are interactions with intensity and Down syndrome. So some studies have found that when they compare an intervention delivered at different number of times per week to individuals with Down syndrome and then other etiologies, that the children with Down syndrome responded differently to those different dose frequencies than other etiologies of disability. So they found they randomized children with intellectual disability to 2 frequencies of a milieu communication teaching. One was 1 session per week, one was 5 sessions per week. And they found that intensity affected vocabulary for children with Down syndrome, but not for children without Down syndrome. So there are some unique characteristics of the syndrome that may interact with the intensity. The other thing we know is that dose also moderates outcomes for individuals with other intellectual disabilities. When we present more opportunities or less opportunities, we see differences in responding. So when we do discrete trial teaching with individuals with developmental disabilities, there's been a lot of studies in looking at the pacing of instruction or the inter-trial interval. And so they change faster paces to slower paces and see how that affects outcomes, and generally finding that the spacing of opportunities moderates outcomes, that faster paced sessions lead to better acquisition for individuals. So shorter spacing, more correct responding. The problem with a lot of these studies is that when they look at spacing, they neglect to think about those other pieces of intensity that I've been talking about. So one way that I could increase the pace of a session or decrease the spacing of opportunities, I could provide more opportunities. So I could have a session that's 10 minutes long, and in one session I present 5 opportunities, and so they're spaced further apart, and in a session where I provide 20 opportunities. So I could increase the number of opportunities. The other way I could do it is to have shorter sessions. So I can have the same number of opportunities, 5 in both conditions, but one I present them, 30 seconds apart, the other I present them 45 seconds apart. So there's 2 ways to go about decreasing the spacing of opportunities. And what these studies have done, they've only looked at one of these. They either presented more opportunities or they presented shorter sessions, but they haven't actually done both and seen which is responsible for the outcome. So there's kind of a compound in all of these studies. Either it's associated with more opportunities, and that could be responsible for learning, or it's associated with shorter sessions, and that could also be responsible for learning. So if we really want to get at how does dose and spacing of opportunities moderate outcomes, we have to think about all of them together. So we could have a condition where we vary the pacing of the opportunities and we vary the number of opportunities, but we hold that session duration constant. We could also have a condition where we hold the number of opportunities constant and vary the pacing of the session, and then of course our session duration has to vary. And then we could also hold the pacing constant and see about those other 2 aspects that we haven't yet looked at. So we started to try and tease apart which of these pieces of intensity is really important for learning. Is it the pacing, or is it something related to the number of opportunities or duration? So in one of our studies, we used alternating treatment designs, and we compared 2 conditions, one where we held the pacing constant and one where we allowed the pacing to vary to see, is it really the pacing or is it something about these other aspects of intensity? And we looked at how fast the learner acquired listener responding skills, receptive language skills. So we were telling them to, touch their head or touch their feet or something like that, and see how fast they acquired that skill. So just back to that chart, so we held the pacing constant in one, and we compared 1 to 20 opportunities, and it was always 30 seconds apart. So some sessions had a low number of opportunities, some had a high. And then for another child, we held the session duration constant, and we still had 1 to 20 opportunities, and here then our spacing varied. So we're really trying to tease apart, is pacing more important? The top panel, we have the number of opportunities that it took to master a skill. The middle panel, we have the time, the minutes that it took to master a skill. The bottom, we have the percentage correct for each of these individuals. On the x-axis, it goes from lowest to highest intensity conditions. So there were 5 conditions from 1 to 20 opportunities, and on the left side is the one where we held the spacing constant, and on the right side is where we held the duration constant. So the pacing could vary. So if we look at the top panel, the number of opportunities to master, from lowest to highest intensity, we're seeing in general an increasing number of opportunities to master that skill. And if we look below that, we also see not as big a difference, but an increase in the minutes to master that skill as well. If we look at the individual where the pacing varied and the duration was held constant, you'll see 2 asterisks at the lowest intensity levels. That means that he actually never mastered that skill in low intensity condition, and that we had a termination criteria and we switched it over to a higher intensity to teach it. So they didn't learn it or this individual didn't learn it at the lowest intensity, and then as we increased the intensity, it took more opportunities to learn that skill. But when we look at the time to master that skill, it actually takes less time. So even though we have more opportunities, they occur closer together, and so it takes less time for them to learn that skill. So in terms of efficiency for this learner, higher intensity led to a more efficient intervention, and a more effective one because it lost its effectiveness at the lowest intensities. And we see some differences as well in the percentage correct responding, although not large ones. And that occurs more for the one where we have this constant interstimulus interval. So from this, it looks like the pacing is really the more important variable. We held it constant and we don't see as huge a difference. When we don't hold it constant, we allow it to vary. It appears to be altering the effectiveness and the efficiency of that intervention. One of the things that we were also interested in is looking at not just how efficient that is, but what other characteristics or what other session behaviors do individuals with Down syndrome display in different intensities. We noticed that higher intensity sessions for one child led to fewer correct responses. And this may have been related to things like problem behavior or off-task behavior within the session. And so we wanted to see that potentially mediating the effectiveness of these interventions. So one of those phenotypic characteristics of Down syndrome, if you work with individuals with Down syndrome, you often hear these stereotypes, that they're affectionate, that they're lovable, that they're nice. And then on the other side, there's this negative stereotype that they are very stubborn and resistant. And the behaviors that tend to lead to this stereotype are these frequent off-task behaviors and low levels of task persistence. So when they're presented with a moderately difficult task, they tend to show a lot of escape-motivated behavior, and what this leads to is inconsistent performance, even on tasks where they previously demonstrated mastery. So I can give the same task that they maybe showed that they could do a year ago, and now when I present it, I get all this off-task behavior, and it now looks like they don't have that skill. And so they call this a low level of task persistence. And also when it's moderately challenging, they tend to display escape behavior rather than trying to continue to solve the moderately difficult task. So we wanted to look at some indicators of this phenotypic characteristics and how it relates to intensity. And so just an example of what these escape-motivated behaviors might look like. I have a video. This one shows one of the really unique ways of escaping tasks for individuals with Down syndrome. So because they have this really great social skill set, they tend to use social skills as an escape motivated response. And what this video shows is a young girl with Down syndrome engaging in joint attention in order to escape a difficult task. If you know lots about autism, you know that joint attention is a deficit, and so we would never see that being displayed. So it's just an interesting contrast to the types of problem behavior that you get based on these different genotypes. So this young lady is being presented with an instrumental requesting task, which is a box with a preferred item, and she has to request help to open that box. And you'll see her engage in a joint attention response in order to escape that. Although I'm not sure if you can hear it. Maybe if I do this. There we go. I'll just go off these pieces. So here she's presented with the box, and what you see is her engaging in that joint attention, trying to direct her parent away from the offering. So she's really using those social strengths to escape a task. So we were interested in seeing if perhaps intensity also modifies some of these in-session characteristics in addition to just how fast they learn the skill. In those previous studies, we didn't directly measure it, but we did notice that there were differences in off-task behavior, differences in problem behavior, and some differences in percentage of errors across the conditions. So we wanted to directly measure this in a follow-up study. So in a follow-up study, we used the same kind of design. We had 3 participants with Down syndrome. They were all preschool age or early childhood. We used an alternating treatment design again, and we had 3 targets that we put in 3 different intensity levels. And we looked at skill acquisition, again, in terms of the trials to mastery and the time to mastery, and we looked at some of the indicators of task persistence. And this time we picked a critical weakness for individuals with Down syndrome at this age, which was expressive language. We also looked at three different ways to manipulate intensity. So we had three different manipulations of intensity. One where we held that pacing constant. So each opportunity was presented 30 seconds apart, and we had from 2 to 10 opportunities, and so then those durations of the session would vary. We had another condition where we held the duration constant. So we had 2 to 10 opportunities again, but they all occurred in 10 minutes, and so then the spacing would change. And we had a third where we held the opportunity constant, but we changed the pacing. So 5 opportunities in each of those conditions presented either 30 seconds all the way up to 150 seconds apart. And this, the reason for doing this is to isolate which pieces really were responsible for the changes in acquisition. So like I mentioned, they were expressive language targets. So these are just some examples of things that were taught: what do you like to eat, where do you live, where do you go to school. And for one child, they were opposites. The opposite of tall is short, and that was his expected response. We tried to equalize the difficulty by looking at some pieces of the vocal response. So we rated them on the typical time which the sound enters a repertoire, the number of syllables, the complex syllable shapes, and tried to rank them using these three aspects of difficulty in hopes of making sure they were similar across the conditions. And we also measured some indicators of task persistence. It was based on an assessment of mastery motivation. So we looked at task-directed behavior, whether the child was on or off or engaging in problem behavior. We also looked at affect, whether they were smiling or laughing or crying or whining during an interval. So again, I have this awful set of graphs, but I've got no other way to show it to you. The top panel, again, is the opportunities to mastery. The middle is the time or the minutes to master a skill. The bottom is the percentage correct. And from left to right, we see lowest to highest intensity for each of those three different manipulations. On the left, we have pace held constant. The middle, the duration is held constant, and the right, the opportunities are held constant. And each line represents a different child. So those are the three different children for each of those manipulations. So if we look across the top set of graphs where opportunities to master a skill, we're not seeing clear patterns when we look at each individual. So if we look at where the pacing is held constant for one, more opportunities as the intensity increased. For another, it was stable. When we held the duration constant, we see a general increase, although it's quite variable. And when we have the opportunities constant, we see similar opportunities to master a skill. So that's not so interesting. But if we go to the minutes to mastery, we get a much clearer picture. So the actual time it takes to learn a skill, when we hold the pacing constant, there's no difference if we present more or less opportunities. It's very similar, and it takes a very short amount of time. When we allow the pacing to vary, as in the two other conditions, we see that it takes less time to learn a skill as we increase the intensity. So this really does show us that pacing is that important piece. It's not about how long a session is or how many opportunities there are in a session. If we increase the pace of a session, we're going to have a more efficient intervention for these particular individuals. And then we see, again, some variability in the opportunity or the percentage across, correct across these different intensity levels. This picture of pacing being very important gets really highlighted if I plot the minutes to master the skill as a function of the pacing of the session or the interstimulus interval. So here we have the 5 different paces that we presented across all these different manipulations, and we plotted the minutes to master a skill as a function of those different paces, and the different colored dots represent different individuals. And some paces have more dots because they occurred more often across those different manipulations. And now that I have this graph, I see a much better way to go about looking at this research. So this is something that I'd like to maybe make this graph a little bit more important in a group design. But we can see that when it's 30 seconds, they're clustered very low. It takes a small amount of time to learn a skill. And when we get up to 300 seconds, we see a lot more variability, and they tend to be a lot longer to master a skill. So shorter paces led to faster acquisition for these individuals. We also measured things like generalization, and I put this video in, one, to show you that they are demonstrating it with another individual, but also because they showed you a bunch of really complicated graphs, and this girl is really cute, and so it's kind of like a little interlude as I start to come to the conclusions of this study. And so this is one of the young ladies in that study who is demonstrating those skills with her mother.
Naomi, what are your brother's names? And? Yeah, much better. The next one. Where do you live? Where do you live? Yeah, what do you do? What do you drink? Yeah, chocolate milk. You got it.
So you can see we accepted approximations from this young lady. She's 2 years old in this study, and in the lab at the time, 2 of the other girls had 2-year-old daughters. So I just went up to them and asked them, to say chocolate milk, and Mama Milk was pretty reasonable for that age group, and so we accepted those approximations from her. And again, most of the children across all the intensity conditions did generalize these skills to caregivers, and there was not a lot of variability as a function of intensity. When we looked at those other responses, like off-task and affect, there were idiosyncratic results. Some of the children had more positive affect in the moderate intensity levels, and other children, we really didn't see differences in these affect and off-task behavior. Well, this isn't as interesting. It does show the same kinds of relationships that we see with intensity in other disabilities as well. So some studies have found that increasing intensity leads to problem behavior, and some studies have found that increasing intensity reduces problem behavior. And so it's hard to say whether or not there is a way to determine what effect intensity will have, and perhaps we could do something like an alternating design to identify which intensity conditions are good for an individual. Despite not finding huge differences in these other behaviors, we should still start to think about how to balance learner behavior in a session with the speed of acquisition. So if we really want to have an efficient intervention, efficiency is about how long it takes to master a skill, but if they show a lot of problem behavior and you want a parent or a teacher to implement this rather than a behavior analyst or someone with a lot of experience with problem behavior, you really need to start to think about how you can balance these responses. Because if I'm a parent and I have a child who's displaying a lot of problem behavior and I know they're going to learn something fast, it's still going to be very difficult for me to continue on with that intervention if we're getting a lot crying or whining, even just not smiling during an intervention. And I really wanted to highlight this with one of the individuals and show what his positive versus negative affect look like, because you can really see what it looks like as an interventionist when they display these behaviors.
Just what do you ride? I ride a bike. No. Okay, listen to me, Josie. What do you listen to? Music. Yay! Good job. Good job, you do. You're right. You listen to music.
Videos much behind. So in that first one, you've got a lot of negative affect. The second one, he's smiling and laughing. And our study was very short. We taught, a small number of targets. If you look at the time to master the skills, they were only a few sessions, taking, a total of maybe half an hour to an hour to a couple hours to master a skill. And so these differences in positive and negative affect might not show up so strongly in our data. But if you imagine carrying on over a long period of time, you start to establish this repertoire of negative affect and problem behavior, you're going to have a very different picture of who you want to work with and what types of interventions you're going to be able to perform with that individual. So even though we're not seeing the big differences in this study, I think it's still something that's really important because it's going to affect how someone approaches a session with that individual when you have these differences, even if they're quite small initially. So in general, when we're trying to figure out how to maximize interventions for learners with Down syndrome, we have to think about effectiveness. Can we tailor to a phenotype? Can we use the approaches that work for this individual? Can we build on strengths? And then we can think about how to make them efficient by varying aspects of intensity. So an inaccurate amount of intervention, whether it's high or whether it's low, is going to be just as problematic as an ineffective one. So this study suggested that pacing is really important. We should think about it, and that there may be some differences in other learner behaviors that we can also consider. And so some of the things that I wanted to go to from here is looking at things like tolerability for the interventionists and for the caregivers. So how do they feel about seeing an intervention that's highly paced, and how do interventionists feel about delivering a highly paced intervention, especially if it's much more difficult? Thinking about other learner characteristics, we look at language, but what if we're teaching a strength versus a weakness, or what if we're teaching motor skills? How does intensity interact with those? What about other types of interventions, not just behavior analytic? So really the question is, it becomes so specific, how much of what particular targets for which particular learners? And, in order to answer that, it may be better rather than focus on here's the intensity for this individual, but how can we find a way to assess what's going to work for a particular learner? Is there a way that we can present different intensities, measure behavior, and say, okay, for this learner, they need a high pace, and for this one, they don't? Thank you. Questions, comments?
So I have some questions just because I'm still trying to wrap my head around exactly what was happening with all these manipulations.
Yeah.
So when you were doing the, okay, so I'm sure I'm going to horribly screw this design.
No, it's a messy one.
Yes. So when you're doing the frequency or the ISI.
Yep.
You're doing 30 seconds for 5. Can you go back to that?
Yeah, that's what I was going to do. I can pull, do you want the graph or the table?
The
I
table,
think it's
yeah.
probably,
Easier to see.
yeah.
That was really helpful, actually.
No, there we go.
Okay, so if I'm looking at this correctly, you have the trial in the ISI is constant. So everybody says you're getting it. One kid is only going to get 1 minute with instruction, one kid's going to get 5 minutes instruction. The session duration held constant, low intensity, that means everybody gets a 10-minute session, but you're getting only 2 trials in that time period. What's happening between those trials?
Yeah, so this was just an activity that was identified as not highly preferred, but that didn't result in problem behavior by the parent. So for these kids, it was things like doing a puzzle, playing with not their most preferred toy, that was used as the reinforcer. So when we did a sort of like a forced toy preference assessment, if they pick the highly preferred one, then the less preferred one would be the activity in between. So this is something that, you know, could contribute to these outcomes. There's potentially more reinforcement if you don't like a task than a big spacing in between them.
Because one thing I was wondering that I wondered if you could manipulate the number, like keep the duration the same, or so the ISI the same, and have the same number of trials, but only have 2 probes in there. Like, so I'm wondering, like, so imagine, like, say you have 3 targets.
Yep.
And you have one target that's done 3 times in a row every 30 seconds versus that target is done 3 times over the course of 10, but they're still getting high.
So like an ask interest.
Yes, I'm wondering about the behavioral momentum in this.
Absolutely.
About the pacing effect is actually you're counteracting something
Of
else.
course.
And so I'm wondering if it's about the pacing of the instruction of the target or the pacing of any type of
It
instruction.
could be. And there are some studies which have looked at mass versus interspersed, and there are still differences in acquisition. And it's also a question of, are you learning a new thing versus maintaining old things? So I think those are great questions is to think about, okay, what if I keep all these other pieces constant, but now change up things like what targets are being presented? Yeah.
Because I can imagine, like, once a kid has fun, we get back to the table. It'd be hard.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's where we see some of those differences in that problem behavior across kids. So some kids are fine with the transition, and other kids, that's not going to happen, right? So if you have a child who, once they get going on something, trying to transition back to an opportunity, then you're going to have huge differences in whether or not that's occurring. And I think, my opinion is the momentum piece is really important for that pacing part, because if you try and run a session and you present things 5 minutes apart, it's hard to get them to pay attention to you once they're doing something else. And so you know, if you only have a couple opportunities to do it, you feel like you wasted the opportunity because it's so much time spent getting them on task again.
I have a question.
Sure.
How do you decide those, when you said hold constant, how do you decide that number?
So the higher intensity ones were based on what we used in previous studies. We tended to do about 30 seconds apart in a 10-minute session with 10 opportunities, or in a 5-minute session, right? So 10 opportunities, 5 minutes, 30 seconds apart. We used that a lot with the learners that we had. The others were sufficiently different that we could maybe say something. Because again, there isn't a lot of literature to say this is good or not good. Well, we know what works. We know what we've used in the past, so that's got to be one of them. But the others, we kind of were like, well, it's got to be low enough that we're going to see something different.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking because I think I'm still thinking it from a linear perspective. So that's why I'm asking, is there must be a plateau.
Yeah.
So like opportunity, if you set it 200 constant, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And when we know it's hit the plateau, that's the question.
Exactly. And I think that was one of the things we saw in the previous study is that for that kid, when we got so low, they just stopped learning. That wasn't enough for them. So finding where that is, and there's going to be diminishing returns. I don't think a session of 50 opportunities presented 1 second apart is going to be better. So there's got to be somewhere that, you know, it becomes ridiculous. So how fast can we go? I don't think an instructor can go much faster than, you know, 25, 20, 30 seconds apart when you think about reinforcement and having to get materials and do all that. It's hard. It's hard to run that session to present things 30 seconds apart. And that's not an inter-trial interval. That's the question is asked at 0 and the question is asked again at 30 seconds. So the inter-trial interval is much shorter. But we do it interstimulus because that ensures that the session will end at the time that we wanted the duration. But most people talk about an intertrial interval, which is from reinforcement to the delivery of the instruction again.
How long do you think that was?
For these guys, I would guess it was 5 to 10 seconds. Yeah. So it was quite short.
You want to have enough wait time for them to respond, but you don't want it. You don't want it to be too short.
Exactly. Yeah. So this one is a very fast. I mean, this is probably at the upper limit of, or the lower limit of what's in the literature. And the ones that I've seen have been about 2 to 5 seconds apart compared to, say, 10 to 15 in terms of intertrial interval. And so for this one, I'm guessing it was probably around 5.
That seems to be a sweet spot.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's what's showing up. Yeah. Yeah. And that's what's showing up in the literature for other disabilities.
Yeah.
Is that 5 is a nice number.
I think unless you're a motor challenge, then
Exactly. And there has been some stuff about even like wait time. So even though you want to keep the pace up, allowing more time to answer might be better for certain learners as well.
I guess the thing that kept coming up in my head is motivation for the task. And I don't know, this is something that I don't know you can always control because children are unpredictable. And one moment they may be motivated by a certain thing and other moments they're not. What role do you think that played in the intervention? Because when you showed the video of the little girl in the box and there was some items, my first thought was, well, she probably doesn't even care about what's in there. So she's like, well, I'll just stay on her parents instead. Right now. They're way more interested in whatever's in the box. So to me, it wasn't an issue of like trying to escape the activity. They were just like, well, that's kind of something that I don't know.
And I mean, that's where that motivating operation piece and the phenotype comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So because of those social strengths, does that make social consequences more reinforcing? Are they more valuable than those task-related ones? And so maybe I'm not interested in it because I have all these skills and social skills, and I don't have any play skills or task manipulation, you know what I mean, toy manipulation skills. We see deficits in exploratory motor skills. So is it a result of that not being, a good item to pick, or is it a result of some of those predispositions towards certain consequences?
I don't know exactly how you could tease that out.
No, I don't think you can. But what we do see is that when we present options, they gravitate towards the social ones, and they don't gravitate towards the things that require motor skills or things that have task-related consequences. Which is much different.
That's what I gravitate.
Right, which is much different than autism. We see the opposite pattern in autism. They're going to gravitate to things with task-related consequences, and they're going to avoid things with social consequences.
But that's because that's where their strengths lie, right?
Exactly.
So
Yeah, exactly.
it's just about doing what comes easiest to you, not
right. But we can condition those things. So that's one of the colleagues that I used to work with is really interested in exploratory motor skills, and can we condition those objects with social consequences, and will we see those changes in, the nice thing about Down syndrome is I know the day they're born, and so we can start to work on these skills. She's working with 9-month-old infants, so that it's nice that you could start that. If we could condition it right away, perhaps we're going to see some decreases later on in other skills.
The interesting thing is just awesome. Also, play deficits, but they are just objects.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not just a deficit. It's
right.
Preference.
Yes. So and I don't know how you go about teasing apart whether it's related to skills or whether it's some other aspect of it that is more reinforcing. Yeah.
Preferential looking.
Yes. Yeah.
So it doesn't involve, when they've done preferential looking in autism, they certainly are attending much more to objects,
right,
to non-specific information. And I'm sure they've done it with the Down syndrome.
I'm sure
attend to social information.
Yeah, definitely. And so, if you know that, that dictated our choice of reinforcers in these studies, that And really, I mean, the social ones won when we did anything paired with lots of highly high praise and all of that. That's what they wanted. They didn't care about the stuff so much.
I just love it. You're kind of link to both populations for different reasons.
Yeah.
So you're trying to condition social reinforcement and autism, right? By linking it with objects, and you're trying to condition object reinforcement by linking it with social.
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's the appeal of this sort of phenotypic approach, and starting to think about, okay, I'm a behavior analyst, but how can I pull from that developmental literature? How can I use that to help inform what I'm going to do? And it can help dictate what you choose as a reinforcer, or what you try and condition, or what prompts you're going to use.
I have another question that's somewhat unrelated to what you presented, but you don't hear a lot about ABA services with autism, and we don't hear about that for kids with Down syndrome. So, is there literature? I mean, I really don't even know anything about this. Is there literature out there to suggest like that we should be doing that? Is it?
Yeah. So in that review, just of the communication ones, the majority were behavior analytics, and there is not a lot of evidence for other types of interventions at all. There's some early work.
Did you look at any that involve like augmentative communication?
That there is literature on that. There's some on behavior analysis. It's not big. There's this group doing the milieu communication therapy, and then there's lots on. The problem is they're not parsing out kids with Down syndrome. They're treating them with just intellectual disability, and they're not saying this is etiology. So there's lots on augmentative and problem behavior, functional analysis of problem behavior, but often it's an individual with a moderate intellectual disability, and that could or could not be a person with Down syndrome. So it's hard to say. There is early literature where they developed the plan, sort of like the standardized curriculum that are out for individuals with autism. There's something like that for kids with Down syndrome. It was done in the 70s, but it never went anywhere. And then the group that I work with now has a contract. We're producing one of those now with all of this literature. So we're putting that manual together. And they don't get services for ABA services in a lot of states. That's not something that's funded. In New York City, that's where it was. Our participants took our data and advocated from the New York Board of Education to get, and they would get 3 hours at max a week of ABA services, and they had to fight for that. So it's not something that is given. But in the New York State Department of Ed guidelines, they
I don't
recommend
even think parents would go that route because they are in early intervention basically from the time they're born to speak. So they're not going to go, oh, I should be doing ABA, whereas parents who have autism, they're told by many people you should be doing this as well.
Yeah.
So are there sort of national technical guidelines on evidence-based practice for Down syndrome?
There is the one I know of, and again, because I came from New York State, the New York State Department of Education, they've done one. Yes, they recommend ABA in that, and that was maybe almost 10 years ago that was done, and yet it's not provided. I mean, none of the participants that we saw, that's not something that they were getting until after they came to us. So it's not common. But that's the only one I know of. There might be bigger ones, but I know New York State has one, and that's where they do it for a whole bunch.
I was really interested also in that literature you were mentioning. Who was providing the opportunities? So was it always like a therapist that was doing it, or was it a teacher of some sort, or was it sometimes a parent, a peer, or I mean, how was that?
It varied. For the most part, they were clinic, and a lot of them were older studies, so they're sort of traditional laboratory type studies. It's strange. There was a lot of interest in Down syndrome around the 70s and early 80s, and then it tapered off, and there's like this big gap, and then now it's very much medical interventions. So can we do like gene-targeted therapies or something like that? That's been a lot of the approach more recently. That too, yeah, of course, which is that's a different thing. That's part of it as well. Yeah, and then the interest in Alzheimer's That's another thing that's a big part of it right now, but not a lot on interventions.
And you said that there were only all these countries that you could find. Are those all in the American context?
I'm trying to think. I mean, we did English language, so that would limit it to English language speaking places. There's one group I know in Norway doing some work on individuals with Down syndrome and reading interventions. And then some in the UK who are doing, they do they're all, the whole range of things. Yeah, but I don't know of groups in other non-English speaking countries.
I'm interested to see the list of the studies that we're doing.
Yeah, for sure. I can make that available for sure. Hopefully that'll be published. It's in submission, so soon, but we'll see.
A week.
Yes, exactly.
Very good.
Thank you. Anything else? Thank you. Yeah.
I'm just curious of where you're going from here. Like, now that you're here, kind of in a different context, are you able to continue with this?
I haven't had the opportunity to sort of go after kids with Down syndrome, just because the kids with autism are so available. I've been working at Eli, so that's made it very easy. I was considering when I returned from Ireland to look at something with individuals with Down syndrome. One of my interests is there's a lot of reading literature coming out on kids with Down syndrome, and I'd love to do some direct instruction stuff with kids with Down syndrome and see how that goes, because there's been some big debate. Can they learn phonologically? Can they not? I'd love to see what if we throw, pacing's good. What if we throw that along with those different components and see if we get good outcomes for kids with Down syndrome in terms of reading. So that was my hope.
The club can access through the Down charity to
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Down syndrome stuff.
Yeah, and so that's something that Geraldine and I talked about, is that there may be some opportunities within Ireland to do that as well.
Yeah, both Dublin and the Limerick area, other facility. I've been to both quite a number of times. It's a very big population.
Yes, yeah. And her and I, another line of research that I'm involved in is comorbid anxiety and autism. And so she also has some comorbid interests of maybe looking at those kinds of things in individuals with Down syndrome within the Daughters of Charity. Yeah. Yes, Down syndrome has taken a back seat, but I wanted to present it because we get to hear autism every week. So I wanted to do something a little, I wanted the eye into the heart to the brains. I'm going to emphasize those last two letters. That's my yeah.
Well, I also like I would imagine, just looking at your data, I would imagine you found relatively similar outcomes. I don't know that this week is phenotype specific.
I don't think so. No, I don't think it's necessarily phenotype specific. And that's we have an IRB proposal in New York for looking at this in autism. So replicating this within some learners with autism. My inclination is to start going to a more individualized approach. Can I do a brief, just like you do a brief educational assessment, can I do a brief intensity assessment and say, oh, here's a learner, I'm going to present 5 paces, I'm going to see which one they have the least problem behavior, they learn the fastest, and now I'm going to teach the rest of their stuff using that pace. And that would be nice, just like a functional analysis, but with intensity. And there's some work that's starting to think about that. But I'd love to make it a brief one to do that.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because I think there's too much variability in terms of even something with a clear genotype, you still get the variability that we get in autism, right? So I don't think it's going to be able to say
for every kid, here's what you get. Yeah, just doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Thank you.